Your team might be agreeing to something nobody in the room actually wants, not because they are dishonest, not because they are lazy. Because of a strange, well-documented trap in how groups make decisions, and it has a name almost nobody outside management circles has heard. It is called the Abilene Paradox. The name comes from a classic story about a family who drove for hours to a town called Abilene just to get dinner. It happened in miserable summer heat, in a car with no air conditioning. And afterward, every single person in that family admitted the same thing. Nobody had actually wanted to go. So how did that family end up on a hot, miserable, multi-hour round trip that not one of them wanted? Each person had simply assumed everyone else wanted the trip. Somebody floated the idea, nobody objected, and that silence got read as enthusiasm. In reality, each person was privately thinking the same skeptical thought. Each one kept it to themselves, because they didn't want to be the one who ruined a plan everyone else seemed excited about. Nobody was excited about it. Nobody said so. That gap between what people privately think and what a group appears to agree on is the entire engine of the Abilene Paradox. What makes the story so useful is how ordinary it is. Nobody in that car was manipulative. Nobody was trying to trick anyone else into a trip they didn't want. Every single person acted reasonably, given what they believed about everyone else in the room. The failure wasn't in any individual's judgment. It was in the total absence of anyone checking their assumption against reality before acting on it. That's what makes this pattern so hard to spot from the inside while it's happening, and so obvious from the outside once someone finally says the quiet part out loud. This exact pattern happens constantly in meetings, and it rarely looks dramatic when it happens. A manager floats an idea. Maybe it's a new deadline. Maybe it's a new process, a new vendor, a new direction for a project. Nobody in the room objects. Silence follows, and that silence gets quietly recorded in everyone's mind as agreement. The meeting moves on. The decision is made. On paper, it looks unanimous. But silence is not agreement. Silence is very often just fear, dressed up to look calm. Each person in that meeting may be individually skeptical, individually uneasy, individually thinking this is a mistake, but each person also assumes they are the only one who feels that way. Speaking up would mean standing out, looking difficult, looking like the one person who can't get on board with what appears to be a shared decision. So everyone stays quiet, hoping someone else will raise the objection first. Nobody does. The result is a decision that technically had zero dissent, and yet somehow satisfies almost nobody who was actually in the room when it was made. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it cuts against the usual instinct managers have when a plan goes badly. The instinct is to look for who made the wrong call, who pushed too hard, who should have known better. But in a genuine Abilene Paradox situation, there often isn't a villain to find. There's just a room full of reasonable people, each one making a small, understandable, silent bet that everyone else already agreed. Blaming an individual after the fact misses the actual lesson. The problem was never any single person's judgment. The problem was a process that never once asked anyone to say their real opinion out loud, until it was far too late to matter. It's worth understanding where this idea came from, because the origin story matters for how seriously to take it. A management professor named Jerry Harvey described this pattern back in the 1970s, using his own family's real trip to Abilene, Texas, as the founding example. He wasn't writing a folksy anecdote for its own sake. He was trying to explain something he kept observing inside real organizations. Groups made decisions nobody inside them actually wanted, while every individual member believed they were simply going along with what everyone else preferred. Once you have a name for a pattern like that, you start noticing it everywhere, and Harvey's case has been cited in management writing for decades since. There's a useful term from social psychology that describes the underlying mechanism here: pluralistic ignorance. That's the situation where most or all members of a group privately reject an idea or a decision, but each person incorrectly assumes that most other people accept it. Everyone is misreading everyone else. Nobody has bad intentions. The distortion isn't coming from any one person lying, it's coming from an entire room, quietly, independently, wrongly guessing what the room believes. Multiply that guess by everyone at the table, and you get a decision that looks solid from the outside while being hollow on the inside. Think about why staying silent feels so much safer than speaking up, even when someone privately disagrees. Raising an objection is visible. It has an immediate, obvious social cost. You might look negative, difficult, obstructive, or simply out of step with a room that appears to already be nodding along. Staying silent, by contrast, feels invisible and free. Nobody notices you not raising your hand. Nobody remembers the moment you chose not to speak. But that asymmetry is exactly the trap. The visible cost of dissent is small and short-lived. The invisible cost of silence, multiplied across an entire team over months, is enormous. Wasted effort, wrong turns, and a project that limps forward with no one actually behind it. There's a related, extremely well-known pattern in social psychology worth mentioning here: diffusion of responsibility, the same broad family of effect behind what researchers call the bystander effect. The more people are present in a room, the less personally responsible any single person feels for acting, because it's easy to quietly assume someone else will step up instead. A meeting full of 10 people isn't 10 times more likely to surface an honest objection than a meeting of 2. If anything, it can be less likely, because each individual can comfortably assume 9 other people will speak first if there's really a problem. Silence doesn't just spread through fear of standing out, it spreads because responsibility for speaking up gets diluted across every extra person in the room. Picture a fairly ordinary version of this at work. A team is in a planning meeting. Someone proposes an aggressive new deadline for a launch. The room goes quiet for a second, then someone says, "Sounds good," and a few heads nod along. In truth, half the people in that room think the timeline is unrealistic. One person thinks it will force corners to get cut later. The project lead privately worries about quality but doesn't want to seem like the one blocking momentum, right after everyone else appeared to agree. Nobody voices any of this out loud. The deadline gets locked in. Weeks later, the team is scrambling, tempers are short, and in a retrospective meeting, someone finally says what they were actually thinking the whole time. Almost everyone in the room admits, quietly, that they had doubts from day one. Sound familiar? It should. It's the exact same shape as 4 people in a hot car driving to a town nobody wanted to visit. The same shape shows up in plenty of other ordinary business settings too, not just deadlines. Picture a hiring committee weighing a candidate everyone interviewed separately. In the debrief, the first person to speak says something mildly positive. The next few people, uncertain of their own read, nod along rather than risk contradicting a colleague in front of the group. Someone with real reservations quietly decides now isn't the moment to raise them. The candidate gets an offer that, on paper, looked like a confident group decision. In reality, it was one early opinion, amplified by silence, wearing the costume of consensus. The same pattern can shape which vendor gets chosen, which feature gets prioritized, or which reorg plan gets approved. None of these rooms are dishonest. They're just quietly running the same untested assumption that started a family's drive to Abilene decades ago. Here's the part that makes this genuinely tricky to manage, and it's worth being precise about it, because people often confuse this pattern with a different, more famous one: groupthink. Groupthink, a term coined by psychologist Irving Janis while studying flawed group decisions in American foreign policy, describes something meaningfully different. In groupthink, people actively suppress doubts they already recognize as real, in order to preserve a sense of harmony and unity the group already genuinely feels. The group has a strong shared identity, and dissent feels like a betrayal of that identity, so people bury objections they know they have. The Abilene Paradox is a quieter, stranger cousin of that pattern. In the Abilene Paradox, people aren't suppressing a doubt they know the group shares. They genuinely don't know whether the group shares it, because nobody has tested that assumption out loud. There's no strong shared identity being protected here, no warm sense of unity being preserved. There's just an untested guess, made independently by every person in the room, that everyone else is on board. Groupthink is too much false certainty about unity. The Abilene Paradox is total uncertainty, quietly misread as unity by default. But here's the part nobody expects, and it's the part that should change how you run your very next meeting. Fixing groupthink often requires slow cultural work, building psychological safety over time, rewarding dissent, changing how a whole team sees conflict. That takes months, and there's no real shortcut for it. Fixing the Abilene Paradox does not require any of that heavy lifting. It doesn't require a culture shift. It doesn't require months of trust building. It requires one specific, almost embarrassingly simple habit applied consistently. Testing the assumption out loud, on purpose, every single time a group decision gets made. Here's the sharp, slightly uncomfortable version of that idea. Most of what gets called team alignment inside a typical company isn't alignment at all. It's a room full of people individually guessing that everyone else already agrees, and nobody bothering to check whether that guess is actually true. Call it consensus if you want. It's closer to a shared assumption nobody has verified. That's not a minor semantic difference. A team that mistakes untested silence for real alignment ends up executing plans with no actual conviction behind them. Conviction is precisely what carries a plan through the hard, boring middle stretch when things get difficult. So, what actually works? Before finalizing a group decision, a manager should ask each person directly and individually whether they genuinely support it, not simply whether they object out loud in front of everyone. That distinction matters enormously. Asking, "Does anyone have any objections?" to a full room reproduces the exact silence the paradox depends on. It hands every skeptic the easiest possible exit. Say nothing, and let the ambiguous quiet get read as consent. Nobody has to commit to anything, positive or negative. The room stays comfortable, and the decision sails through, hollow all the way down. The fix flips that dynamic completely. Go round the table and ask each person by name. Not, "Does anyone disagree?" but, "Do you personally support this? Yes or no?" That single change removes the hiding place everyone was counting on. General silence, aimed at a whole room, costs nothing and reveals nothing. A direct question, aimed at one specific person, requires an actual answer. It's a small shift in mechanics, but it closes off the exact loophole the entire pattern depends on to survive. A 5-second pause and one direct, individually aimed question can save weeks of quiet resentment and weeks of wasted effort spent building something nobody actually believed in from the start. Think about the real cost math here. 5 seconds per person, multiplied across a team of 6 or 8 people, is maybe a minute of extra meeting time. Compare that to the cost of a project that limps along for 2 months on borrowed enthusiasm. It gets quietly resented the entire way, then torn apart in a retro where everyone finally admits what they were thinking all along. The 5 seconds is cheap. The silence is not. It helps to think of this individual check-in the same way a pilot thinks of a pre-flight checklist. Nobody assumes the plane is broken just because the checklist gets read out loud before every single takeoff. The checklist isn't a sign of distrust in the crew. It's a deliberate, repeatable habit that catches the rare, real problem before it becomes an expensive one in the air. Asking each team member by name every time a real decision gets made works the same way. Most of the time, everyone genuinely agrees, and the check-in takes a few extra seconds and confirms what was already true. Every so often, it catches a real, unspoken problem before the team commits real time and real budget to a plan nobody actually wanted. This also changes how a manager should think about their own role in the room. It's tempting to believe that staying neutral and simply not pushing an idea too hard is enough to avoid steering a group unfairly. But a manager who proposes an idea and then asks, "Any objections?" to a quiet room isn't actually being neutral. They're relying on the exact ambiguity that lets everyone hide behind polite silence. Neutral doesn't mean passive. Real neutrality means actively creating space for a genuine answer, not just technically allowing one that almost nobody in the room will ever actually use. There's also a slower, cumulative version of this cost that's easy to miss if you're only looking at one meeting at a time. A single Abilene-style decision is annoying but survivable. A team that repeats this pattern, meeting after meeting, quarter after quarter, builds something much worse than one bad project. It builds a quiet culture where nobody expects their honest opinion to matter, because experience has taught them that silence is what usually gets treated as the answer anyway. Once that expectation sets in, people stop bothering to form a strong private opinion in the first place. Why sharpen a view nobody is going to ask you about directly? That's a far more expensive outcome than one miserable drive to a town nobody wanted to visit. It's a team that has quietly learned to stop thinking hard about decisions at all, because thinking hard was never going to change anything anyway. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this about how teams actually communicate, or quietly fail to. Most workplace communication problems aren't really about people lying to each other or hiding secret agendas. They're about people making quiet, reasonable, seeming assumptions about what everyone else is thinking and never checking whether those assumptions are even true. 4 people assumed a hot drive to Abilene sounded fun to everyone else in the car. A whole team assumed a tight deadline seemed fine to everyone else in the room. Neither group had bad intentions anywhere in the chain. Both groups ended up somewhere nobody actually wanted to be, purely because nobody tested the assumption before it hardened into an actual plan. If you manage people, the practical habit worth building is specific and repeatable, not vague advice to simply communicate better. Before you lock in a group decision, stop and go around the table. Ask each person by name, out loud, whether they actually support what's being decided. Not whether they object, whether they genuinely support it. That framing matters, because it puts the burden of an actual answer on every individual person, instead of letting a comfortable, ambiguous group silence do the talking for everyone at once. It's worth adding one more layer here, because the fix is deceptively simple to describe and easy to skip under time pressure. When a meeting is already running long, going around the table person by person can feel like an unnecessary delay. One more box to check before everyone can leave the room. That feeling is exactly backwards. The extra minute spent asking each person by name is not overhead sitting on top of the real decision. It is the actual decision process. Everything before that point was just a proposal floating in the air, waiting to be tested. Skipping the individual check-in doesn't save time. It just moves the real cost of the decision later. It lands as weeks of half-hearted execution, quiet resentment, and a retrospective where the true opinions finally surface, far too late to matter. Hit follow if this changed how you see your team. Here is the practical takeaway worth carrying into your very next meeting. Your team might already be agreeing, right now, to something nobody in the room actually wants. The only way to find out is to stop asking the room and start asking each person by name, one at a time. That 5-second pause is the difference between a decision your team actually believes in and another long, miserable drive to a town nobody wanted to visit in the first place.